Welcome to Verses and Visions Creative Conversations, where creativity and purpose meet to inspire and uplift. I'm Cassidy Beck, your host, here to explore the stories of artists, dreamers, and changemakers who are walking in faith and using their unique gifts to make a difference. Each episode is a reminder that your vision, paired with God's purpose, can transform the world around you. Let's get started and spark some inspiration together. We are delighted to be welcoming Joseph Ashcroft. Joseph Ashcroft was born and raised in Ryrie, Idaho, which is halfway between Rexburg and Idaho Falls. He has had a creative mind for as long as he can remember, a creativity that was sparked by immersing himself in stories, including Harry Potter and Fablehaven. He also managed to get through J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings while being in high school, and because of his autism, it felt like an achievement. Joseph believes two things. The hardest stories to hear are the ones that have no vocals, and you're never too old to learn. Welcome, Joseph.
Hello.
You mentioned that you've always kind of had creativity, that you were born with creativity. Tell us how you have kind of harnessed that creativity in your life.
It's kind of hard to say for sure what's going on there because for the most part it's just playing around with various bits and bobs. I can still remember as a kid being out in the dirt on the farm growing up, just watching water go run through the various little channels, thinking like, "Oh no, it's a flood." And otherwise that's that little bit. Actually using that creativity in real life, it's more or less limited to the powers of observation during like at my job, for instance. Like, why is this not doing what it's supposed to? Oh, I see. It's because this part is getting in the way of this other part, and it's all getting discombobulated and all that other good stuff.
So you use problem solving a lot?
Yeah, it's a very methodical approach that I usually end up using.
Tell us about what you're working on right now.
So there's actually a couple of different projects. There's the most recent one, which is also tropey, but at the same time, you look back on your life and you realize, oh my gosh, my life was a trope. It's a trope because it's true. The big thing that I'm working on right now is a fantasy novel, and the single hardest part about it is that I've got this whole made up language that I'm having to keep track of almost every step of the way. And also earlier today while I was working on it, oh, I realized I've also got to keep all these names straight, even though they only ever come up once or twice. Because the characters know who these other people are. The audience doesn't necessarily don't. But you got to figure it out. Well, I got to figure it out.
That's incredible that you invented your own language for the book.
Yeah, originally I was going to use a blend of Indonesian, German, but at some point I realized that seems a little bit low effort. Like for instance, the Indonesian word naga, which is just dragon. So you can easily guess how and why I was using that word.
Tell
Well,
me.
maybe. I'll tell you, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically in this world, obviously dragons exist and they have the ability to bless people with the elements of their birth. For example, you have fire dragons, obviously, that bless people with the magic of fire, but you've also got less common subspecies like water and earth dragons that, well, obviously bless people with powers over water and earth.
Wonderful. So tell me something that you've learned recently.
It's actually basically two things. You've heard of the Nordic mythology, right? Ragnarok, for instance, that story kind of started coming around as Christianity was taking over Northern Europe. And the biggest reason why we have such clear records of the Nordic mythology is because those same monks painstakingly transcribed the Edda and other Nordic texts into their own language, word for word, which is incredible in one way. You got to realize these are pagan deities that don't line up with our modern views. And these monks did a really good job of just preserving that history, if only so that we know Okay, yeah, we don't want to be like these guys, but we can understand where they came from and how they got to that little and how they got to that point.
So now I have heard of Ragnarok before, but the way that I have heard of it is through Thor, like in Marvel, Ragnarok.
Ah, okay,
So we might
so
need to back up a little bit more and tell me more about Ragnarok.
okay, so yeah. Okay, so basically Ragnarok is the demise of the Nordic pantheon and its attempts to prevent that. There's a recent show. I haven't actually watched it yet, mainly because it is just way too violent and explicit. But there are people who have watched it, and they their insights into it go a lot deeper than I will. But at the end of the show, Jesus Christ actually shows up, and by our mind, this is about the Nordic pantheon. And that's how I even figured it out in the first place. Like, hey, why did Christ show up in the show? I know why. Here's why. So that happened there.
Okay. What show was that you were referring to?
It's Netflix's Downfall of the Gods, and after
Okay.
reading all the content warnings, I realized, yeah, not for me. Not for
Okay.
me. Say not for
Gotcha.
me the same way that Game of Thrones is not for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me about some of the stories that you love.
Stories that I love. Well, you brought up like Harry Potter and Fablehaven in my bio. My heart will always rest with The World of Aragon by Christopher Paolini. That is that was awesome as a kid reading that growing up. I still remember going through all four books in a week at one point. It was a senior writing English essay.
Joseph, why do you write? Why is writing important to you?
Writing is important to me simply because it gives me a way to get everything that goes on up here
Mhm.
onto something that I can read, either in the physical sense or even through the digital sense. And it's not just that either. Writing isn't just limited to books. I mean, we've all seen the movies and TV shows with their writing. There's also video games and everything else that way. It doesn't have to be limited. And frankly, that's the part that I like the most is the fact that it's not limited to one thing.
I hear you saying it's really important to transfer the ideas in your head onto paper, and that good writing and storytelling isn't just in books, but it is in movies. It's also in video games as well.
Yep, that's exactly right. The visual and interactive mediums both have their strengths and weaknesses, same as books do.
It's interesting that you say that because I was taking a writing class, and one of the people that I was in the writing class with really was into Dungeons and Dragons, and he wanted to do like a successful campaign, and he wanted to learn more about story elements and world building so that he could put it into his campaigns. I would have been interesting to see like his campaigns before and after this class and to see the difference that that had made.
Dungeons and Dragons definitely does have that storytelling aspect, and it definitely depends on the dungeon master in question. I know a couple of guys who are phenomenal storytellers, and others who are definitely struggling. There's this one author on YouTube who goes under the name Tale Tinkerer. He does these daily fantasy words of the day. Like yesterday's word was I can't remember what it was exactly, but it's just like you don't think these can be magical, fantastical things, but then you realize, oi, I can apply magical, fantastical things to these seemingly ordinary objects and make something entirely new out of it.
So, why have you chosen fantasy, Joseph, to write in
Fantasy,
fantasy?
fantasy for me has always been the best kind because it shows off a sense of creativity that in my mind exceeds a lot of others. You're creating an entire world. You're sharing your innermost dreams with other people, so to speak. Nothing against authors that use the real world with some other elements on top, or even just realistic or nonfiction writers in that sense. But to me, fantasy writing, creating that world, creating that history, creating everything that happens inside of it, that takes a lot of effort, as I can attest to, because this project has taken me 4 years so far, and primarily because I keep on thinking, how does this other thing work? And And how, for instance, this world, I've had the idea for the longest time that it was going to have two suns in the sky. I kept on thinking, how are the seasons going to work? And I got something figured out finally after a couple of months of figuring it out and also playing around in Universe Sandbox.
Um, so tell me about some of the stories that you loved or you feel like you've been inspired by.
Well, definitely the ones that have already been mentioned. Lord of the Rings, I can still remember so many things from that. Early on, they come across the three trolls frozen in stone,
Mhm.
and they're thinking, "Oh man, we gotta stay out of their line of sight." And then they realize, "Hold on, these guys are already dead."
I love Lord of the Rings. I read all of it. I read The Hobbit too, and my kids are getting older, and so I was so excited to share it with them. And I wanted them to be like, "Ah, this is amazing, thank you." And that was not the experience that they had. The storytelling of Lord of the Rings, not only in the book by J.R. Tolkien, but also as the filmmakers and producers, the CGI, the costumes, the acting, all of it, I feel like is so amazing.
Yeah. There's also a few things that were not scripted that definitely made the cut. Everybody knows how Aragorn's actor broke his toe kicking that helmet at the start of the Two Towers. There's also the one city and the flag comes fluttering down to land on the ground. That was not scripted at all. That happened by chance, and they rolled with it. So yeah, at least in filmmaking, occasionally good things that happen by chance like that, like the fluttering flag or Victor breaking his toe, those things stay in because they just seem so genuine and real, or they enhance the story already being told.
So I love that idea. In writing, we here, are you a pantser or a plotter? Meaning, like, are you someone that is going to really have meticulous notes, like even before you put pen to paper, that you know exactly where the story is going to go? Or do you just kind of let the ideas flow? And I feel like ideally almost you do both. Like you have a plan of where things are going to go, but then you allow it to, like, I guess, kind of organically evolve. And when something comes up, you don't just say, "Oh, well, I can't use that because it's not a part of my blueprints or whatever," but that you allow it into the story. But tell me how that works for you.
For me, so the big project came up at started with this scene in my head that's way down the time that's way down the future timeline. And frankly, telling the story like that wasn't appealing to me because there are plenty of pieces, let's say, tell the that tell the middle or near to the end of the story before the beginning, and I just feel robbed almost of a character when and that's been one of the hardest things in my experiences is not starting in the middle. Start at the beginning, build up the character to that point, and don't rob the reader in that sense.
That's interesting that you bring that up, Joseph, because I had to tell you about my experience with an editor. I have like a full draft of a sci-fi and I gave it to an editor. And it's hard because you have editors to make your story better. But her feedback was a little bit hard to hear and to grasp my head around it. And partially, I think it's because she was right. But she had said, you know, your middle part is where things get really interesting. So that's actually where your story should begin. And that whole like first section, just that's good backstory. It's good that you know it, but the book should start in the middle. And I was like, oh, the pain.
Yeah, yeah. There are definitely some stories that benefit from starting in the middle, so to speak, because let's call it like a Genesis effect, sort of, where if you start at the creation of the world, your readers are going to get very, very bored very, very quickly. But if you start somewhat in the middle, where the characters know the history and occasionally reference it every once in a while, then yes, that's good. I suppose in a sense, I am starting in the middle because there is a lot of history that I figured out that isn't even going to be brought up until much, much later. But you want Right, and it's not even about robbing the readers. It's about providing context behind what's going on. Like, how is this character so powerful? Well, here's his heritage, for instance. But you definitely don't want to start with Revelations before going all the way back to Genesis if we use the Bible as a reference point here.
Yeah. 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 One of the things that I really like, I'm trying to think, there was a pub that I can't remember the name of it, but it was in England where writers met, including J.R. Tolkien, to kind of discuss the things that they were working on. Do you have like a group or some people that you like to discuss your books with?
I wish I had a group to discuss my books with because then I think my process would be going along just a little bit faster because then I have somebody to bounce ideas off. Well, more than just myself to bounce ideas off.
Yeah.
For, yeah.
I feel like it's hard too because I think you have to figure out the right time. Because for me, I think I shared it too early where it wasn't totally ready and it needed to stay with me. It needed to sit with me a little bit longer before I was like ready to get feedback on it. Is that something that you've experienced as well?
Getting feedback early on is definitely a game changer. There's some folks in a Discord that I'm in that have said, "Hey, yeah, sure, I'll beta read when you're ready." They've been an invaluable help, pointing out a couple of things that caused me to partially rewrite the first several chapters of the big project because I realized, oh, I haven't actually told anybody where this takes place. I should correct that.
Well, and I feel like it's really funny because in your mind, like you know where it's taking place and you can visualize it so well. And it's hard to like let someone else like read it from their perspective where like no they don't know where it's taking place because that's not written in there, and so that's something that I've like experienced too. You're like, but I swear it's there, but it's just, it's in your mind, it's not on the paper yet.
Your audience isn't a mind reader. That's the biggest lesson.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Tell me about the tropes that you enjoy.
Stuff like gigantic power boost at the end because the hero has earned it and he and needs it to defeat the big bad for one reason or another. That's a trope. That's a trope that I enjoy because you're just like it's not that the hero has trained to the point where they can take on the villain right at the end, but their connections have given them the pathways to defeat the villain because they're friends and power. I know that sounds like a whole power of friendship trope that a lot of people love to go, that's such a bad one. But if it's done well, it is done well.
So I feel like a lot of times people that are creative enjoy like other different creative endeavors as well. Is that the case with you?
So stuff like Magic the Gathering, for instance, there is a whole creation aspect to getting a legal deck ready. I've learned that the hard way.
I don't know what Magic the Gathering is.
It's a deck building card game. You get the cards, you build a deck, and then you face off against other people's deck. That's the most basic level. There are a bunch of rules how you can build your decks and how many cards you can have, but that's the basic rule.
So when you're building your deck, you're not like physically like drawing the characters on it. You're giving like the cards are already created and you're putting together people like forces or whatever or a team together.
Basically, yep.
Okay, I gotcha. Kind of like fantasy football, I suppose.
Yeah, kind of like fantasy football. Yeah, I want this player as my quarterback. I want this player as my running back. I want these three players as my defensive line, all that other good stuff.
Yeah. So I love you mentioned two things that you believed in your bio, and I wanted you to tell us a little bit more. One of the things that you said is the hardest stories to hear are the ones that have no vocals. Tell me what you mean by that.
So it's stuff like instrumental music. If you've ever heard instrumental, and you can hear the hero's journey in some of them. You can hear a passionate romance or a deep, dark betrayal as part of one song. It all goes down to what is being used. For example, if you were to take all the music out of your favorite movies and listen just to the music, you could probably hear the events that were going on in the movie during that music. That's a great aid to getting started, to hearing the story and the beats.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was thinking of the power the intro of Harry Potter had, and I think that for me it just brought out excitement because I had read all of them before the movies came out. And so it was just like, oh, I know what's about to happen, and it was just filled with excitement for me. And so absolutely I can totally see what you're talking about with that. Another thing that you said that you believe that I thought was really interesting is you're never too old to learn. So tell me something that you're learning right now or trying to learn.
One other thing you could say about learning every day is, and I'm going to quote Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last Airbender here, it is important to draw wisdom from all different sources, otherwise it becomes rigid and stale.
Hmm. Oh, Uncle Iroh. I love the
Yeah.
Avatar series. I think it's so good. It is so good. So one thing that I just learned, or I'm trying to learn, do waveforms. It's just kind of like I guess, the visual of the audio. That's what I'm trying to learn right
Gotcha. I've heard of people turning images into waveforms. They sound horrendous most of the time, but there's a few that somehow click. I've also heard of people hiding images in their waveforms.
I'm not doing anything that fancy, Joseph. I'm just taking like voices and trying to like add the audio waves to it so that you are showing what the wavelength of people's voices. I
Right,
don't
yeah.
know.
Yeah, that little visual bit where you see a line and it just jiggles up and down as whenever somebody's talking.
Exactly. It's like the heartbeat line, but for voices.
Exactly. Yep.
There we go. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about yet?
Ooh, kind of going back on the drawing wisdom from different sources, getting information and ideas and inspiration from not just people around you and maybe not just people in your country, but also people in other countries. Oh, hey, look at all these Japanese series that I like. Obviously, there's the big ones like Naruto and Bleach and Full Metal Alchemist, but there's a few others, like one older one called Inuyasha. That one I haven't watched in so long. There are ideas in there that have inspired me in some way or another, like the power of the soul, for instance, and that's used in a couple of them.
So that's really neat. And I like that idea of getting inspiration from other sources. And a previous interview that I had, a podcast guest had talked about how different societies tell stories differently. And so I think that that's pretty interesting because you were saying it's more like Japanese storytelling that you're inspired by.
Partially. It's not just the Eastern storytelling and that sense of mysticism, it's also the Western storytelling and the core Christo-Judean values that are inspiring as well.
That's awesome. Joseph, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
You're
To
welcome. Thanks for having me on.
our and to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep creating, keep dreaming, and keep bringing your visions to life.